We're here today to launch, as part of the World Environment Day celebrations, a new report by UNEP, the UN Environment Programme, and IFID, which is the International Fund for Agricultural Development, a report about smallholder farmers. Smallholder farmers have great resonance in this country of Mongolia and great resonance around the world. What is interesting about this report is that it focuses on the plight and the poverty of smallholder farmers across the globe, but also spotlights and underlines how smallholder farmers could well be one of the great catalysts for not only overcoming poverty, but also delivering the kind of sustainable future that we need in this world, with 7 billion people going to over 9 billion by 2050. So why? What the report talks about is that there are 2.5 billion people directly or indirectly linked with smallholder farming. It's an extraordinary number of people. The report also points out that many of these people are living in real poverty, despite the fact that they produce something like 80% of the food in developing countries. Many of those farmers and their families are living in very serious poverty. The question perhaps is why? And I think we have to look at the model of agriculture as practiced in many parts of the world in the 20th century and still to this day, and the model of agriculture that might allow people to perhaps work with nature more than working against nature. A lot of the investment that went into farming in the 20th century was for what they call the Green Revolution. And that favored, and I have my colleague from FAO here, so I know he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but this tended to favor very large and ever larger farms in which basically these were sustained by lots of fertilizers and lots of pesticides. And of course, it actually fed large numbers of people. But as we sit here in the early 21st century, we know that issues of pesticides and pesticide use is a challenge to public health and the wider environment, if not done properly. We know that the excessive use of fertilizers in some parts of the world are leading to all sorts of unintended consequences in terms of dead zones emerging in coastal waters, which challenge fisheries and other things. And we also know that the land which is productive on this planet is actually shrinking, because there's a lot of land degradation and a lot of land desertification, in part linked with this very intensive agriculture, which has been part of the world stage for many, many decades. The smallholder farmers, as this report outlines, have in a sense been in part bypassed by that green revolution, because they don't really have the money for these fertilizers and pesticides, and so they practice a more kind of traditional farming in many cases. This is not to say that in fact they are not causing environmental degradation on smallholder farms, but by virtue of the fact they're living in poverty, and by virtue of the fact that often their produce has problems getting to market, they are forced into a kind of short-termism which can lead to environmental degradation. On the flip side, these are the farmers and these are the farms with some of the greatest diversity of crops and plants that you may find on the planet, because these people often husband some of these different kinds of food crops for growing in their fields. So they are a source of biological or genetic diversity, which will be very important in terms of feeding a population of over 9 billion by 2050, because science will have to look to genetics to try and find improved crop yields. So many of these smallholder farmers living in poverty, many of them trying to practice a form of sustainable agriculture, but being in a sense shortchanged by the system as we have it now. How could that be different? And what would it mean for the environment, and what might it mean for poverty? Well, the first factor from this report, which I find absolutely fascinating, is that investing in smallholder farmers is probably the biggest bang for your buck that you can get in terms of lifting people out of poverty. You'll see in the report here that one study shows that a 1.5% increase in agriculture per capita GDP can reduce the poverty gap 5 times more than a 1% increase in GDP in other sectors. In other words, if you invest in smallholder farmers, those 2.5 billion people, you can lift more people out of poverty than if you invest in other kinds of sectors, I suppose transport, for example. And there are some other facts here that show that, again, another fascinating fact, show that for every 10% increase in farm yields, there's a 7% reduction in poverty in Africa and a reduction of over 5% in Asia. In other words, if you want to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, and we are achieving them in part and doing quite well in many areas, but not perfectly, but if you really want to accelerate achieving the Millennium Development Goals, this could be the sector that we should be investing in right now up to 2015. The other fact that emerges in this report, which is really interesting, is it talks about sustainable intensification. And I think when you read that phrase in this report in terms of smallholder farmers, what we're actually talking about is what are the intensive measures you need to assist these people not only grow food, increase their yields, get their crops to market, and basically lift themselves out of poverty while also feeding the world and not basically damaging the ecology or the environment around them. And in part this is about education. In part it's about different options for different kinds of sustainable agriculture. It might be in some cases organic agriculture. And it's also about, therefore, if it is organic and other forms of farming, it's about certification. How do you certify your products so you can sell them on the international markets? So I think when you read these areas, plus as well, you need to help with science and technology and investment in new kinds of seeds, seeds that don't require high inputs of fertilizers and pesticides, the kinds of seeds that smallholder farmers can actually use on their land. So, in short, you've got the report, you've got the press release. It's the view of UNEP and IFAD, and I'm sure other colleagues, that with smallholder farmers, you have the chance for potentially lifting large numbers of people out of poverty and achieving even better the Millennium Development Goals for a relatively low-cost investment. You also have within this group of 2.5 billion very diverse people around the world, very diverse communities and farmers, you have also the potential for a transition to a green economy by basically supporting these smallholder farmers in terms of the kinds of seeds they need, the kinds of education that needs to be provided, and, for example, the kinds of getting their produce to market so they're not forced into a kind of short-termism that is actually undermining their ability to produce food rather than contributing to the green economy. And on that note, I'm going to move here to Fulai Sheng. Fulai Sheng is a UNEP researcher, economist, very brilliant chap, who is based in our Geneva office in Switzerland. He's a member of the UNEP Green Economy team. If you don't know what the green economy is, well, in Mongolia it's one of the big conversations this week and has been for many months now, green development. The green economy was an idea that UNEP had in about 2008 at the height of the financial and economic crisis. And in principle, what it simply says is, how do you actually grow the global economy? How do you put people into more employment, but in ways that do not push us all, or humanity's footprint, through what we call planetary boundaries? In other words, how do we live in harmony with nature and use the benefits of nature without trashing nature? And how do we do it in a way that grows economies and increases employment? And as you know, at the Rio Plus 20 summit in June last year in Brazil, an inclusive green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication was given the green light by heads of state and also by governments who attended Rio. So, Fulai, where does agriculture fit into the green economy?
Thank you, Nick. First of all, I think this report in front of you is actually an extension of a larger report UNEP launched in November 2011, commonly known as the Green Economy Report. In that report, we basically looked at a scenario where we consider 2% of the global GDP to be allocated to green 10 economic sectors, and see what would happen to the environment, to the economy, jobs, as well as to poverty situations. And agriculture is one of the 10 sectors. Taking this opportunity, I would like to communicate with you some of the key messages coming from that chapter in the larger Green Economy report. And by the way, that chapter on agriculture in the Green Economy report was led by Dr. Hans Herren, who is the president of the Millennium Institute. There are 6 major messages coming from that chapter. The first one is that in order to feed the growing population, I can never distinguish between R and L. I'm often ridiculed by my daughter for that. In order to feed a growing world population and in order to really address the issue of hunger, both the so-called industrial farming or conventional farming as well as traditional farming, they need to change, need to be reformed. And Nick already mentioned some of the major problems caused by industrial farming associated with the so-called Green Revolution, characterized by high chemical inputs and the pesticide use. But traditional farming also can cause problems, as Nick also mentioned, especially for the very poor people. They may have to resort to some very destructive forms of farming, such as farming on steep slopes, such as clearing forests or converting forest lands to farmlands. So both the industrial farming and traditional farming, they need to be changed. Otherwise, we are going to undermine the very ecosystems on which the future of the world's agriculture depends. That's the first message. The second message coming from that agriculture chapter of the Green Economy report is that in this transition from the current farming practices towards what we call green sustainable agriculture practices, in this transition period, we might anticipate some modest decline of industrial farming because some major adjustments are needed to industrial farming practices. But this adjustment would also open up the opportunities for improving traditional farming in order to increase the contribution, the positive contribution of traditional farming to sustainability. Because even though the traditional farming might also have some environmental impacts, compared to industrial farming practices, traditional farming have a good basis to really move towards sustainable, more conservation-oriented kind of farming practices. That's the second major message. Okay, that is, we might anticipate some modest decline in the industrial farming practices, but we might see a major opportunity for the expansion and further improvements of the traditional farming practices. The third major message from that chapter is that the reduction of crop loss and the food waste is an integral part of the green agriculture agenda. It is a very important component of the green agriculture agenda. Why? Because according to the research we did in that chapter, about half of the food produced each year, 50% of the food produced each year is lost or wasted. That's very staggering, right? So at least we should aim to cut down this kind of waste, this kind of loss, at least by half. We have to reduce this kind of waste, this kind of loss. However, as Nick also mentioned, the investment in agriculture in the past years has been on the decline. And in particular, for this particular issue of food waste and the crop loss, globally, only 5% of the agriculture investment, research investment, is devoted to address this issue of crop loss and the food waste. Only 5% of the funding for agriculture research is given to address this problem. Okay, we need to increase the funding to address this problem. The next key message is that the greening of the agriculture sector requires significant investment, as I just mentioned. But this investment really needs to be put into many areas, including better water conservation techniques, for example, better transport system for agriculture products, better storage, for example, and better soil management skills and practices, things like that. We need investments, we need research, and we also need to enhance the capacity of farmers to manage their land sustainably. The fifth major message from that chapter is that small investment in the greening of agriculture can generate large return. According to one estimate, for example, done for Asia, in order to get poor farmers in Asia out of poverty, okay, you only need to invest each year between $32 or between $32 to $38 per household. You only need to invest this much money in order to get poor farmers out of poverty in Asia, and the return, the financial return from this kind of investment can be between 40%, 40, and 50%. So it's a very high return for very small investment. The final message coming from that chapter is that we need policy support. Greening of the economy, greening of agriculture requires policy support. In particular, we need to address the so-called environmentally harmful subsidies that go into the use of fossil fuel, that go into the use of water, and so on. So we need to really address the incentives that make people use water and energy irresponsibly. At the same time, we need to provide positive incentives for people to change their practices, their farming practices. Internationally speaking, we also need to look at the issue of how to expand market access for sustainably produced farm products from developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Fulai. That was excellent. Now, I'd like to go to Mrs. Tungalag from the Ministry of Agriculture and Industry of Mongolia. And we were just talking earlier upstairs a little bit about organic agriculture, and I know that that's an issue here in Mongolia. And certainly worldwide on the global markets, I think organic food and produce is commanding a higher price. Certainly we have good examples from Uganda where they're getting 3 times more for a pineapple than they are with normally produced pineapples. And Mrs. Tungalag, if you could also maybe understand you also deal with the issue of food loss, which would be very interesting to mention given the fact that the slogan for World Environment Day is Think, Eat, Save, Reduce Your Food Print.
Okay,
thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. За сайн байцгаана уу? Би монголоор ярьчих гэж бодож байна. Бас ийм өнөөдрийн одоо хэвлэлийн баг хуралд манай яамнаас бас урьж оролцуулсанд баярлалаа. Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you very much for inviting us from the Ministry of Industry and Agriculture.
Тэгээд яг уу энэ жилийн одоо энэ байгаль орчны өдрийн ураа нь болохоор зэрэг сэтг, хэрэгэл, химэн гэсэн ураатай юм байна. Тэгэхээр энэ ураа бол яг одоо олон улсад явагдаж байгаа одоо энэ маш их эрчимдсэн аж ахуйгаас эргээд одоо нөгөө үрхийн одоо үйлдвэрлэл рүү шилжихтэй илүү одоо байгаль орчинд ээлтэй тийм үйлдвэрлэл рүү шилжих энэ одоо цаг үед болж байгаагаар бас чухал ач холбогдолтой гэж үзэж байна. Хөдөө аж ахуйн үйлдвэрлэлт эрчимдсэн аж ахуйгаас одоо бид нар буцаад одоо энэ органик үйлдвэрлэл рүү шилжих ердөөсөө гол бидний гүүр болвол Монгол улсад энэ органик хөдөө аж ахуйн одоо үйлдвэрлэлийг дэмжсэн тийм эргэцэн орчныг бий болгох шаардлагатай байгаамаа. За тэгэхээр үйлдвэр хөдөө аж ахуйн яамнаас органик хүнсний тухай хуулийн төслийг боловсруулад гаргасан байгаа. Бид нар 2013 оны 11 сард улсын хурлаар хилцүүлэхээр төлөвлөсөн байгаа. Тэгэхээр Монгол улсад бол бид нар одоо юу гэдгийг одоо энэ өндөр хөгжилтэй орнуудыг араас нь хөөх биш те угтаж одоо энэ хөгжлийг нь одоо хөгжлийн энэ үе шатыг нь угтаж явах тийм боломж бол харагдаж байгаа юм. Тэгэхээр органик одоо хөдөө аж ахуй органик хүнсний тухай хуулийн төслийг одоо энэ 11 сард хилцээд бид нар хэрвээ энэ хуулиа батлуулж чадах юм бол манай энэ фермерийн аж ахуйнууд те манай малчид энэ тариаланчдад бас одоо яг энэ дэлхийн нийтэд хүл нийлж алах боломж гарах юм а гэж үзэж байна. За тэгээд доктор Фулай Шенгийн хэлсэн одоо түрүүний одоо яг бидний өмнө байгаа одоо энэ тайланд дурддагдсан бүх одоо асуудлууд бол ерөнхийдөө энэ органик хөдөө аж ахуйн хуулиар бол зохицуулах боломжтой гэж үзэж байгаа. Ер нь өнөөдрийн байдлаар бол бид нар Монгол улсын хувьд бол хүнс хөдөө аж ахуйн салбар бас тодорхой хэмжээний одоо хөгжлийн түвшинд бол хүрж байна. Бид нар сүүлийн үед бол хөдөө аж ахуйн салбарт одоо яг энэ хөрөнгө оруулалтын хэмжээ их өссөн. Тэгэхдээ энэ хөрөнгө оруулалт те энэ хөдөө аж ахуйг хөдөө аж ахуйг дэмжсэн бодлого маань өөрөө ингээд их зөв чиглэлд явах хэрэгтэй юм аа. Тэгэхгүй болохоор бид нар одоо юу гэдгийг дахиад бид нар эргээд одоо тэр маш хэмжээний ургамал хамгааллын бодис хэрэгэлдэг, пестицид хэрэгэлдэг те. За тэгээд одоо байгаль орчинд ээлтэй бус байгаль орчинд хор нөлөө үзүүлдэг ийм үйлдвэрлэлийг одоо дэмжсэн бодлого явах юм бол эргээл бид нар дахиад одоо энэ хүмүүсийн унтсан байгаа нөхөнтөл унна гэсэн үг. Тэгэхээр энэ одоо эрсдлээс хамгаалахын тулд бид нар илүү хөдөө аж ахуйгаа доктортой байгаль орчинд ээлтэй тийм замаар хөгжүүлэх боломжийг ердөөсөө хамгийн эхнээс нь эхлээл одоо хайж олох. За энэний нэг гарц нь бол би одоо энэ органик хөдөө аж ахуйн одоо хууль гэж бодож байгаа. За тэгээд одоо Ник маань надад хэлсэн одоо манай Монгол улсад тухайлбал хүнсний энэ хаягдaltaй холбоотой тий бид нар одоо нийт авж байгаа ургацынхаа тий нэг 30 орчим хувийг тодорхой хэмжээгээр алдаж байна тий тэр маань байгаль орчны нөхцлөөс болж байна бас энэ хадгалалт тээвэрлэлтийн нөхцлөөс болж байна тий тэгэхээр энэ хөдөө аж ахуйд гараад байгаа энэ хаягдлыг бид нар яаж бууруулах боломжтой вэ? За тэр талаар бол үнэхээр яг манай одоо яам болоод энэ хүнсний асуудал эрхэлсэн төрийн захиргааны байгууллага засгийн газрын түвшинд бол өнөөдөр одоо бүр айхтар яригдсан юм бол байхгүй байна. Тэгэхээр энэ одоо үйл ажиллагааг бид нар ямар нэгэн байдлаар бол судалгаа хийж үнэхээр манай Монгол улс хүнснийхаа үйлдвэрлэж байгаа хүнснийхаа яг хэдэн хувийг алдаад байна вэ гэдэг дээр бол бодит судалгаа хийх хэрэгтэй юм байна гэж би бас хувь хүнийхээ хувьд мэрэгчлэлтний хувьд үзэж байна. Тэгээд бид нар хэрвээ энэ хэмжээгээ ингээд тодорхойлчих юм бол за үнэхээр энэ одоо хаягдлын хэмжээг бид нар яаж багасгах боломжтой юм тэрэн дээр бид нар ямар одоо хөрөнгө оруулалт хийх боломжтой юм гэдгийг бол бид нар цааш нь бол бодлогодоо тусгаад явах одоо шаардлагатай гэж үзэж байна. За анхаарал тавьсанд баярлалаа.
And finally, we're delighted to have Mary McLean, who is the representative of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN here in Mongolia. And Mary's going to talk about some of the challenges facing smallholder farmers in Mongolia